Forum for Asia. I'm Yang Rui. China has been at the forefront of Asia's connectivity drive. It's been putting together trade and investment mechanisms, keeping routes viable and upgrading infrastructures along the New Silk Route economic belt. Although most observers acknowledge the benefits of regional integration, there is still speculation and suspicion around China's motives. Has China's One Belt, One Road initiative triggered anxiety among countries on geopolitical and geoeconomic terms? Does the country have what it takes to lead Asia's connectivity? Today, I'm very happy to be joined here by 6 brilliant panelists from Asia. Let's give them a warm applause.
Justin Yifu Lin is now the honorary dean of the National School of Development at Peking University and the former senior vice president of the World Bank. Stephen Groff is vice president of the Asian Development Bank, responsible for its full range of operations in East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. Fan Gang is one of China's most prominent economists and one of the most active reform advocates. He is now the director of the National Economic Research Institute and chairman of the China Reform Foundation. Elka Pangestu is the former Minister of Trade of Indonesia from 2004 to 2011, and the first female Chinese Indonesian to hold a cabinet position in Indonesia. Ha Jiming is vice chairman and chief investment strategist for the investment management division in China at the Goldman Sachs Group. Prior to taking on this role back in 2011, he was chief economist and served as managing director at China International Capital Corporation. Jacques is a visiting senior research fellow at the London School of Economics and a visiting professor at Tsinghua University. His book, When China Rules the World, is a bold and controversial account of China's rise to prominence.
Let me begin with a simple question for every and each of you. How do you envision the future of Asia's interconnectivity? We start with Justin.
Well, it will be a new driver for continuous productivity enhancement and dynamic growth in Asia.
Steve?
I think it's inevitable that the interconnectivity between the Asian economies will continue to grow and will continue to drive prosperity and poverty reduction and a more inclusive type of growth across the region over the course of the coming decades.
Fan Gang.
If we can really increase the investment and a real planned investment in this region, I think in 10 years we can achieve a lot.
Mary.
Increasingly, East Asia is a market, and it will continue to grow. So I foresee in the coming years, as we deepen our cooperation through the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is the East Asia consolidation of all the FTAs, we will have deeper, broader economic integration. And if we have the infrastructure component in there, it's even going to grow at a faster rate.
Now, comments from representative of investment bank Goldman Sachs, Jiming, please.
Asia now accounts for about 20% of the world GDP, but with this connectivity initiative, I think that the share of the economy will further increase, and it will continue to be the locomotive for global economic growth.
Martin, are you surprised about the rise of Asia?
No, I'm not. I mean, it's not new. It's been going on for some time, and I regard the interconnectivity issue as the sort of latest stage in a longer-term process of Asian integration. And the fact that the population of Asia is so huge and the disparities are so great increases the importance of this process, but also makes it more protracted. And I think we're going to see some very big changes over the next 10 years.
Thank you very much for your short and yet convincing, insightful comments at the beginning of our discussion. Up next, let's take a quick look at the background footage.
The U.S. is welcome abroad China's planned Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. That's what the Chinese Vice Financial Minister Shi Yaobin told the press after the White House rebuke of Britain's application to join the AIIB, which will provide a financing platform for China's vision of building a new financial order.
时代需要大格局，大格局需要大智慧。
A sagging property market, excess capacity at home, mounting foreign reserves, and a goodbye to the double-digit GDP growth of the past 30 years. China's economy is facing an uphill battle as it enters the so-called new normal phase of economic growth. Shifting away from its traditional reliance on domestic production and exports, China is now looking to regional integration and interconnectivity as a major solution. From building high-speed railways in Central Asia to expanding a port in Sri Lanka, China's One Belt, One Road initiatives aim to connect the continents. However, the United States has made it clear that it prefers for China to play by the established rules.
But in this engagement, we are also encouraging China to adhere to the same rules as other nations.
President Obama doesn't want China to be, quote, a free rider.
They are free riders. And then they've been free riders for the last 30 years, and it's worked really well for them.
But China said its strategy is open to all.
中方欢迎有意愿的国家作为创始成员国加入亚投行。
Let's start with Martin Jacques. Do you think the U.S. will accept China and share the center stage with the competitors in the Asia-Pacific region?
I think it's very resistant to the idea, and it is very anxious to retain a sense of its own primacy in the region. But I think that the evidence of the last month, in particular around the AIB, suggests that the United States is now really on the back foot in relationship to this. It's on the defensive, and it's been isolated around this issue. So I think the United States will have to review its position because it doesn't want to have a situation like this again, I wouldn't have thought. So I think the Americans do have to come and accept an equal partnership, at least, with China in this region.
Lawmakers in the U.S. Congress have been very reluctant to approve the reform of the governance of both IMF and World Bank, meaning to raise the voting powers of emerging markets. That has somehow prompted China to set up AIIB, or for other emerging markets to establish what we call the BRICS Development Bank, as well as the Chinese initiative of the New Silk Road Fund. What do you think of this structural contradiction, and do you think the U.S. is ready to make quick concessions under such circumstances?
Well, I think if U.S. is really concerned about promoting prosperity and poverty reduction in Asia and in other developing countries, certainly they should welcome any initiative which can contribute to that goal. And you mentioned about the governance reform in the World Bank in order to allow emerging market economies like China to play a larger role and to contribute more should be welcome. And the new initiative like Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, New Silk Road, should be welcomed because they contribute to the goal that has been advocated by the World Bank, by the U.S. for such a long time. And now we have some players who can contribute to that cause, certainly should be welcome.
Mary, you have been nodding with a broad smile. Does it indicate that Asia is ready to embrace the U.S. participation in IIIB?
Yeah, I believe the Chinese side has been very clear that this is open for all membership, and for us as a potential recipient in Indonesia, where we do have a financing gap for infrastructure needs, we welcome the more possibilities to get financing for infrastructure under good governance structures. We welcome it, because we have been experiencing as a recipient of bilateral funding from China for infrastructure, and as we know, whether it's Indonesia or Africa or in Laos, there have been issues where we want to, if the outcome is a win-win, how do you make sure that the recipient country can get the most advantage also from the infrastructure building? And I believe that if you put it in an AIIB context with better transparency, better governance principles and criteria, there will be learning experience for all, both the recipient as well as the potential donors.
Fan Gang, despite the active participation by the UK, Germany, France, Italy and Switzerland at the initial stage of the application, People have been concerned with such issues like transparency, inclusiveness, whether it's going to be mutually beneficial or reciprocal. Do you think that these put together constitute the universal standards for good governance?
Yeah, I think China committed to those things, good values and good governance, and everybody also agree on that values. I think the controversy here actually basically is a dilemma U.S. are facing, the U.S. raised. We listened to the video footage. Obama said, first of all, China should not be a free rider. China, well, if you say it's a free rider or not, China had been a developing country, have not been very, to have much initiatives in the world. That's for sure, in the past years. Now China have initiatives. This bank is a China initiative. We don't think that China will take the leadership, but it definitely is an initiative. So that thing we should welcome. But then the Americans think that this is something more difficult.
Excuse me, does the initiative actually indicate a strong leadership?
No, that's another thing. China means China take more roles, more positive roles, more, if not say the leadership, make more contributions. So a willingness to make more contributions. And you can say China start to play some role of leadership. But anyway, it's coming. And when China start to grow and Chinese officials more familiar with the international affairs, international organizations, so China is going to have more initiatives.
Jiming, why do you think eventually the UK, along with other European powers, have agreed to join the AIIB despite opposition from the US?
At the beginning, we saw a lot of developing countries are very keen on joining this AIIB. I think there's a tremendous need for infrastructure construction in the region, in Asia. And, there are international organizations in the world. Some of them were established several decades ago. But the reality is that the region is still badly in need of infrastructure. So there is an efficiency issue. You can have very transparent, very good international practice standards. These are definitely important, absolutely important. But at the end of the day, you need to get things done. The fact that many organizations existed for decades, but the region still needs a lot of infrastructure is very telling. If you go to some large countries in the region, you don't see high-speed railway. You don't even see subway in their major cities. But in China, in the past few decades, China moved very fast in these areas. So there are some expertise that China can share with the region. So that's why I think these countries are very enthusiastic in joining this AIIB. But why at the later stage other countries start to join as well? I think they realized it's the trend, and you have to get on board. You have to catch the train, otherwise you're going to be left at the station forever.
Do you think AIIB's existence threatens to change this principle of IMF and the World Bank?
Well, I mean, to be quite blunt about it, the IMF screwed up in the Asian financial crisis. I mean, it got it wrong. And some economies, notably, for example, South Korea and Thailand, suffered very much as a result of the behavior of the IMF during that period. And the IMF lost legitimacy in this region seriously about its competence to handle these kind of questions. And if you remember, Malaysia was one of the countries arguing for capital controls, for example. IMF was against this. Now, capital controls are widely accepted. So I think that this was a very important moment. But more generally, I mean, if you look at the AIIB, I mean, when it was established, 21 founding countries, then Indonesia, 22. Now, what was interesting about it was the sheer representativity of Asia. East Asia, South Asia, Central Asia. This was already a really profound movement in the region in favor of this initiative. Now, you raised the question of what happened, what was the significance of the UK and so on. This was a profoundly significant moment. You know, the UK has not crossed America since the Bretton Woods arguments in after 1945. Never. Always followed the United States. The one moment it didn't was it never sent troops into Vietnam. But that was the only thing it never did. And then suddenly, the UK does something extraordinary. I think that there has been a drift taking place away from the United States, but not very clear, not very articulate. But what happened in this case was, I think there's been a deeper shift in the British government over the last year and a half on the question of China, because it wasn't one of the lead players on China in Europe. I mean, Germany is the lead player. Germany is far more advanced. Britain has been a laggard in relationship to this. But there was a realization, and I agree with you, there was a recognition that this initiative was extraordinarily important, offered great economic opportunities not just for Asia but for European nations to get in. It was important for the City of London and the link with the RMB. And so you had what I'll call a China moment. I agree with you. You get on now or you're behind. So the British did something which was completely unexpected, which is they took the lead. And I think this was politically a very important moment, that America's closest ally since 1945 crossed the Americans, ignored the advice, and signed up.
Jiming, you were in Indonesia during the Asian financial crisis as representative of the IMF. Is it necessary to reform these two bodies?
Back in the early 90s, when I joined the IMF, I was obviously a bit younger. So I learned a lot from the IMF, and particularly I learned a lot from my assignment in Jakarta during the Asian financial crisis. And the situation there was very difficult, but actually the IMF policy prescription at that time was not conquered by everybody in the world, not even by some people in the government. But in the end, things moved out gradually, and there are positive, negative comments on this. But I think overall, IMF did a fine job. One thing I would like to highlight here is IMF is very good at macro issues. But that does not mean there's no room for other international organizations to fill the gap. For example, in terms of infrastructure investment, there's a lack of funding at that time. And now, actually, if you look at the country, they just scrapped the oil subsidies, leaving the budget bigger room for infrastructure investment. But the need for infrastructure investment is much bigger. So there is definitely a place for an international organization, even a new international organization, to play in this area.
IMF is very good articulating certain ideas, but not necessarily those ideas are conducive to the stability and growth in the developing country.
Yeah.
We know that since the 1980s, IMF has been champion of capital account liberalization. And we find in the 1980, 1990, and early 2000, the volatility in a developing country actually increased instead of reduced. And also the average annual growth rate in the developing country was lower than the 1980s and 1960s and 1970s.
I think the things is not the choice of efficiency and international organization, it's a sufficiency and a more international organization. So we have a lot of demand in the region for the more international investment. So more institution, one more or two more, that will be welcome. So that's number thing. It's not a conflict with the existing one, but just additional one. And secondly, just like Yifu and others said, there's a lot of the criticism of World Bank, IMF, existing international organizations. One thing, add to your point, before the Asia crisis, IMF is advocating for full convertibility, full liberalization of a capital account. and afterward nobody talk about it. So a lot of, we need to change it. It's not the perfect, any institutions. So from that point of view, some new initiative, some new organization, some new try may be good.
Do you think there is inevitable clashes between ADB and AIIB, or do you think they would rather be mutually complementary?
No, I don't think clashes between institutions are inevitable at all. I think you look across the landscape of financing institutions in Asia or globally, and multilateral, bilateral, private, public institutions cooperate and coordinate all the time. ADB has a goal of 100% co-financing of our investments, meaning for every dollar that we invest, we would mobilize another dollar. Other institutions have similar objectives. So there's plenty of demand out there for infrastructure investment, and there's plenty of room for cooperation and coordination across the spectrum. I think the key is this issue of standards and meeting the standards. For every dollar that we invest, we have a set of standards that applies. And in order for us to be able to cooperate and coordinate, we have to reach agreement on those standards with the partners that we work with, be those individual governments or be those co-financiers within those countries. So that's the challenge.
Yes, Mary, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to join this debate. I'd like to disagree with you and concur with you that the IMF didn't do such a good job in Indonesia. And the same people, Larry Summers and Tim Geithner, were in charge of the 2008 crisis, and they did the total opposite of what they told Indonesia to do, which was close the banks, austerity measures, which I think in analysis, I'm not saying this, I think without analysis, that it led to a deeper crisis than what would have happened. Okay, but that's the past. I would like to draw the parallel to AIEB and World Bank and ADB to what came out of the Asian crisis, a learning experience about the importance of regional mechanism that can complement multilateral mechanism, which is the Chiang Mai Initiative. Because the crisis, 97 crisis, it was an issue. Okay, we couldn't draw on reserves, and so the idea, if you remember, came up, Asian Monetary Fund, and then it actually didn't come out as a concrete proposal until the 2008 crisis again. I'm referring to the Chiang Mai Initiative, which actually is a combination of using IMF principles, but there is a component of it which is on the softer part. So it's a combination, because not all countries are needing reserves when they're already in huge crisis. Sometimes you just need it to tide over, and that's the part that's kind of the softer. So you're combining the international standards with a softer standard, but still linked to the international standard. So I believe, as a process, regional institutions or mechanisms such as Chiang Mai Initiative and this potential AIIB can be complementary and linked to the multilateral systems. And there's going to be a two-way learning. They're reforming, the multilaterals are reforming, we'll be informed on that. And as we go through our regional process, maybe we'll find out something new that can also reflect back on the multilateral reforms. I mean, that's the way I see it from what's happening in the region.
I agree that there's no one-size-fits-all policy, economic policy in the world. But countries have different features, different characteristics. Now, when most countries don't talk about capital account liberalization, exchange rate flexibility, but China is the one that is talking about this, right? So when some policies were abandoned or disregarded by others, they may work in some other countries. I think China is at the right moment to further open up the capital account and seek exchange rate flexibility, because the renminbi is now playing a very increasingly important role in the world. It's now the 5th largest currency in the world.
Can I just say on the question
I was not saying the country should not liberalize, but what I was saying that IMF at that time asked everybody, not a conditional, just liberalize, give the deadline or something like that kind of practice.
I mean, exactly. I mean the same thing. When a policy is not suitable for some countries, it could be very good policy for others.
There's a time framework for that.
On the international financial architecture, I mean, I think it's a deeper question than just saying, come on, let's have 100 institutions, let's have more institutions. There's something much deeper happening here. You see, I don't think the IMF or the World Bank are going to disappear. Of course not. They perform a function. But they perform a limited function. And historically, they are the creations of the developed world. And their voting structure and their power structure reflects this. And the appointments at the top, the American at the World Bank, the European at the IMF. Now, and institutions like this can no longer represent the world, because the center of gravity of the world is shifting dramatically from the developed world to the developing world, where 85% of the world's population lives. Now, in that situation, we need a new international financial architecture where there are institutions, multilateral institutions, which can express the needs and interests of the developing world. The significance of the AIIB is that it has captured this moment. It has expressed this mood for a new change. But it is not, it's only a symptom, because I think that other things will flow from this. We're going to see a huge change in the international financial architecture over the next 10 years, in my view.
All right, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We have to leave you there for the moment. You are watching Dialogue Special, coming to you from World Forum for Asia, but we shall be back in a short while. Please stay with us.
TPP, RCEP, and the FTAAP. These combinations of letters represent planned free trade areas promoted by different countries in the Asia-Pacific region. The US-led Trans-Pacific Partnership includes 12 countries in this region, but China, the largest economy in Asia, has been excluded. ASEAN is also pushing forward the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or the RCEP, which shares 7 members with the TPP, but features China in a major role. Both groups are forces to be reckoned with. The TPP accounts for some 32% of the world's GDP and 26% of global trade, while the RCEP makes up 24% of world GDP and 28% of global trade. Beijing aims to combine these various free trade initiatives into one framework, known as the Free Trade Area of the Asia-Pacific, or otherwise known as the FTAAP or FTAP.
Every other few days, we're going to have a new catchphrase. We are talking about AIIB, but in fact, quite a few months back, people were talking about the TPP or TTIP, FTAAP, or RCEP. Now, these sound like tongue twisters. Actually, they have a lot to do with how to write or rewrite the rules for the regional trade and investment. Let's look at the rivalry between TPP and FTAAP. Do you think they are necessarily incompatible with each other?
China is a linking point. If China is part of both, then all the issues will be solved. And also, I think China should be, should join the TPP, and at the same time, I think that the U.S. should join the AIIB.
Steve.
Well, since 2002, we've had a quadrupling of FTAs in Asia and the Pacific, up to about 144. There are another 130-odd free trade agreements under discussion right now. So it's clearly these are initiatives that are beneficial individually to countries, but they contribute to this Asian noodle bowl of trade agreements. And so we need to be taking steps both to think about consolidation of these trade agreements under any of these various acronyms.
Is it easy job, therefore, to talk smart about FTA now in this region alone?
You know, TPP and RCEP are two very different approaches. TPP starts off very comprehensive gold standard agreement with everything in there, including environment, labor, and intellectual property rights, and very stringent investment requirements. Whereas RCEP is a building block approach. You started with ASEAN, and then you had ASEAN +1, including with China, and then all the other 5 East Asian countries, Korea, Japan, India, Australia, and New Zealand. And the idea of RCEP is building block, and it's more suitable for the different levels of development because you can have different speeds, if you like, and different ways of joining, right? And this is really, I was involved in the kind of the birth of RCEP, and we deliberately built in an open accession clause, which is trying to operationalize open regionalism, much like AIIB is open, right? RCEP is actually open. Right now we have 16 members because it's the 10+1, the 6 10+1s. But anybody want to join, including the US? They can, right? It's open. And we are already in the process of negotiations, whereas TPP is not finished yet, the negotiations. So I think this is a building block process, and irrespective of the final outcome, whether you're really going to have, on the good side, actually it's already free trade. It's very, very low tariffs already because of all the ASEAN +1 FTAs. We are now working on the non-tariff barriers, the services, the investment standards is going to be a very important issue, movement of people, and so on. Maybe it's going to be a long time in coming, but the process, I think I like to emphasize that the whole process of being part of negotiations and regional integration is very important for developing countries because you're learning, if you like, you're learning how to compete, how to be part of the global community. So I think you have RCEP going, maybe TPP will come sometime, and these are kind of different pathways to someday having an FTAAP.
What do you think of the relationship between neutrality and centrality?
I think ASEAN is actually very much in that mode with our Treaty of Amity and so on. And we have been able to prosper because we have a peaceful region, whether we are talking about ASEAN or East Asia. So it is in our interest to continue a process of ensuring peace in the region, including how to handle the disputes in the South China Seas. And I would say there's been positive progress with the dual-track approach that China is now adopting with peaceful resolution of dispute. And the second track is not to deal bilaterally with each ASEAN country, but to deal with ASEAN.
Is China ready for a push and boost in the construction of infrastructure in Asia?
I think the risks are clearly there, and that's why an international organization is so important in providing such a funding for infrastructure development. Bilateral investment always carries this kind of, let's say, geopolitical challenges. Multilateral institution could, to a degree, reduce this kind of risks, because two countries may have very good relationship at a time when things are going very well, when projects are being financed. Then there's a change in government in one country, suddenly the relationship broke, then you have problems. So I think that's why China, in my view, should get together with the area, with countries in the region, form like the AIIB and the other initiative. Maybe there could be other initiative in the future to have a concerted effort in building this kind of infrastructure. And this way, I think the risk could be reduced a little bit.
And this is, though, again, to go back to the original part of the discussion, this is why we have safeguard policies and procedures in place, is to articulate, measure, and minimize all of these types of risks. And so there is an argument out there about international safeguards or international best practices, but at the end of the day, the purpose of these practices is simply to minimize risk. And I think also what we're hearing is the fact that while connectivity is an element of connectivity is infrastructure investment and physical connections, it's much more complex. There's a softer side of this that needs to be taken into account with respect to trade and trade facilitation, with respect to capacity, with respect to trans-border disease control, with respect to all sorts of different elements that we need to be taking into careful consideration when we think about these types of investments.
Well,
Thank you very much.
That the purpose is good, but whether all the standards and criteria are desirable. I can give one example. In IMF and also ADB, you have this debt ratio, right? And if you reach certain kind of debt ratio, then you stop lending altogether. But you do not distinguish between consumption type of credit and investment type of credit. For a poor country, if they have a good project and they can kickstart their dynamic economic growth, and that kind of project will generate a return in the futures. Under that kind of situation, maybe they already hit the debt ceilings, but I would think it will be desirable.
But as long as there's transparency around that, because I think the challenge is a lack of transparency, which we don't understand. You know, we rely on these measures because there's in many cases not a lot of transparency.
I certainly agree transparency is desirable, but currently, even with transparency, if you hit the debt ratio, you cannot borrow anymore.
Up next, let's have the Q&A. Questions from the audience here. I believe you must have your own comments and questions as to the issue of transparency, whether it's inclusive enough. Let's have this gentleman.
Martin, you say China one day rules the world. History is remembered mostly through some major events. For me, China's Maritime Silk Road and China's proposal of AIIB could be these major events. So how do these kind of events would fill in, or like a kind of a stepping stone in your allegation of inevitability of China ruling the world?
I should make it clear at this point that the title of my book, China Rules the World, was not to be taken literally. No country has ever ruled the world, and no country ever will rule the world. What I'm talking about in this context is the rise of China to a position where it is the leading country in the world, where it is the predominant country in the world. In this context, of course, replacing the United States. And I see absolutely no reason to revise my view on this. In fact, events have moved even more quickly than I expected them to do. And you mentioned the AIIB in this context, and I think this is a dramatic illustration of how there is a big shift taking place across the world in terms of how China is perceived, what is expected of China. I do expect China to become, in a relatively shorter space of time than I anticipated, the predominant country in the world. And the effect of this is going to be very profound. Some things quite soon, other things over a much longer historical period. For example, will there be a new international system? Oh, come on, let's be serious. Of course there's going to be a new international system. I mean, leaving diplomatic niceties on one side, the rise of China means, and the decline of the United States, which is indeed what we're witnessing, is going to lead to a new, certainly financial and economic architecture in the world, but in the longer run, I would expect a profound political shift of architecture as well. I mean, China, in my view, is not a nation state in the same way as other countries in the world. I argue that it's a civilization state primarily and only secondary a nation state. Is that going to have no impact? Yes, of course it's going to. So we need to have a sort of imagination about and a sense of historical change to understand the deep shifts that we're living through already, and we will certainly live through for many decades in the future.
This gentleman, please.
Good morning. My name is Ravi Bhosalingam and I come from India. My question is to the panel in general, so anyone is free to answer it. There have been some apprehensions expressed about the AIIB in that it might not match up to the standards of governance and transparency and so on. But my concern is somewhat different. I would like to ask whether it is going to be radical and revolutionary enough to think creatively and out of the box, not be confined by the examples of past institutions, because in Asia today, while we have the largest population, 80% of the world, we also have the largest amount of poverty. And to remove poverty, you need fresh and radical thinking. For example, the definition of infrastructure. Is it only going to be hard infrastructure, bridges, high-speed rail, and so on? Or is it going to be education and health? That's one question. Will the RCEP, now going to the other part of trade, is it going to take care of the concerns of poorer people on intellectual property rights, which might result, if we are not careful, in raising the price of medicines for poor people? Will financial enablement of the poor, like microfinance, as we see in our neighbors in Bangladesh, which has been very successful, will that be taken into account? So my question is not that it's going to upset the apple cart, but will it really think creatively? Thank you.
Thank you very much. You already self-addressed your point. I think I agree with your point very much. That's why I would like to argue, of course, Chinese officials and others are now talking about, of course, we will apply, the same rule, transparency, all of this. But existing international organizations are not perfect. What they have done may not be sufficient for the developing country in particular. And why we cannot create something new? Why we can have some new practice which are not really directly compatible with the existing international organizations. So that's what I like to argue. New institutions, also new initiatives, and a new approach to something, particularly if this among the effort of all developing countries for developing countries. I think that's something we really needed. So I agree with your question very much.
Yeah.
I agree very much with what Pangestu just said, and I agree with the sentiments of the question. You see, so far the discussion about AIIB has often been couched in, well, is it going to have the right governance standards, transparency, and so on? Now, really, do we think this, the proper template for this is the World Bank and the IMF? Please, no. We're trying to break with those practices. We've got to think afresh and anew, and I agree very much with what Ravi says, which is that we need something which is inventive, something which is bespoke for the problems of our time. And this is the great question. I agree with your points earlier about RCEP, and this is my skepticism about TPP. TPP is essentially an American creation with American standards for American interests. That's what worries me about it. Whereas RCEP at least allows for what you describe as indigenous or organic growth.
I'd like to agree with you that the devil is going to be in the details of what the AIIB is going to look like. There'll be a leadership issue, criteria, and then what infrastructure. And apart from the poverty alleviation and soft and hard infrastructure, I would add sustainability. You've got this opportunity to build new infrastructure. You should be doing it in an environmentally sustainable manner also. So you have this opportunity to already be addressing the Sustainable Development Goals, for instance. And then obviously the intellectual property rights issue, which would be a negotiating issue in the RCEP context. Definitely for generic medicine and so on, and other things, including this IT technology access, which is going to be a huge poverty breaker, in my opinion, would be another area that I would focus on.
Now the energy technology.
Energy technology, exactly.
I think all the international organizations always say competition is good, but should not compete with us.
But I also think I think that the word that's missing in your statement is innovation. I don't think. I think the connotations of the word radical and revolutionary are you throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think existing institutions are not perfect. I think I don't think anybody in existing institutions would state that we're perfect. We're not. We have rooms to improve. We have room to become more efficient. We have room to innovate. But I think that what we would hope from any new institution is more innovation as opposed to revolution or radical approaches, because that suggests that there's nothing to learn from the current system. And I think there's a lot to learn from the current system, and there's a lot of good practice that we can develop from the current system and apply in anything that follows on.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I do appreciate your very dynamic interactions and comments. With the rise of Asia, with China being the leading powerhouse along with other major emerging markets, promises to change the world map fundamentally through close interconnectivity. But is China ready? What does it take for this country to assume the leadership? And will the US share the center stage with its competitors and geopolitical rivals? With that, I promise to keep our discussion open, but more on our normal edition of Dialogue, every day at 7:30 p.m. Beijing time. But of course, I would love to see you the same time next year here at the Boao Forum for Asia. Dialogue with the thinkers. Thank you very much.